So today we will be talking about, what has to become one of my favorite books by Wayne Baker, which we have here on the screen. No, we're not going to work here. We'll put that in the because I always read a lot of book on Kindle now, so I always have to take my iPad up, Wayne. Sorry about that, but actually I'll find it for later in our conversation. All you have to do is ask. I got it to work now. And I am not only, a book I've read once, I think I'm the fifth time as I'm preparing this interview with Wayne today. And it's such a simple idea, but so powerful. And as I've been reading it again and again, I found out other guests that's been on the show talks about it. They maybe not call it ask, but they talk about involving people to get better solutions or thinking out of your own thinking. And my friend John that gave me this book, or bought it and forwarded it to me on the Kindle, he's built his whole, business around it now as well. And he goes around talking about this as a philosophy into. So this is a very, very powerful book. We're going to be talking about that. So I'm very excited to welcome you, Wayne, to the show. It's an absolute pleasure. And I'm sure we gonna give some great advice, and maybe some people is gonna have a whole new mindset around what actually you can do with this simple little gesture of asking.
Oh, well, thank you, Michael. I'm very glad to have an opportunity to speak with you.
Wayne, how did it come along that, you've been on a journey, and how did you end up with finding out that you have to write a book about all you have to do is ask?
Well, I can trace the origin of the idea back over 20 years ago when my wife Cheryl and I created an activity that we call the Reciprocity Ring.
Mm.
And that is a group level activity for a team or a group, people who come together and they're required to do two things. One is to ask for something that they need and explain what it is, why they need it, when they need it by, and so forth. And then other people in the activity will respond and see and describe how they can help. Perhaps they've got the answer, they have the resource and they can share it, or they don't, but they can tap their outside network and make a connection so that person can get the response or the resource that they need. So it's a very structured way of doing this. There's a recipe that we've developed for the reciprocity ring, but that's basically what it is, a mechanism to enable asking for and giving help in a group or a team. And I always started that activity the same way. I gave a little lecture about the importance of generosity, the importance of giving, the importance of really responding to what people have asked for. But I found that was never the problem. People were extraordinarily generous and helpful, but almost everyone struggled with coming up with a request, to come up with an ask. And I was surprised at first, and I would kind of encourage people, try to motivate people to do it. And then finally, I realized, you know what? This is difficult for most people. So I started to do research on it and eventually wrote this book. All you have to do is ask to enable people to get better at asking for what they need. And of course, you want to be generous and help people, but it's amazing the crux of generosity is not getting people to help, it's getting people to ask.
And what was it like? Where was the tipping point for you where you thought, okay, here is something that might really can impact the world in a positive way? When you read your book, it's all about actually how can you put more, positivity out in the world. You can feel that theme going through, and how can you help people to live, the best life possible. But where was the tipping point? Because it's always, from doing, research or whatever you do in life, you run a business, some point you just know, I need to go and do this thing. I need to go and live it fully.
Well, it was an idea that really evolved over time. It did start with the reciprocity ring, but as we used that over the years and gained experience with that, I found that it would work in different languages, different countries, different cultures. People would say, "Oh, this will never work in
Hmm.
Asia." Well, it works in Asia. It'll never work in the Middle East, but we've done it in the Middle East. It'll never work in Germany or Denmark or wherever, but it's been done all over the place. And I really started to get really fascinated with this idea of the way in which, we all need things, right? We need resources. No person is an island. We need social capital. We need resources from other people in order to be effective. And I started to, do more research on it. I started to collect other activities or learn about other activities or ways in which you can enable this whole flow of resources in the world's network. And it really enables people to be better engaged in the world, to get over that fear of asking for what they need. And really, it really mobilizes the resources that are out there. So individuals are more effective, but teams are more effective, and whole organizations are more effective as well.
Yeah, and you talked a bit about it in the intro to here, and also you talk very clearly about or write about it very clearly in the book where you talk about these barriers for people to ask. People, principle, just find it very difficult to ask for things. And I always say to myself before I go into anything now, I've got this mantra saying, what is that I'm going to ask about by the end of this meeting, this coffee conversation? What is I want to ask the other person to help me with? Because you never know what's going to happen. You don't even know who they know. But why is that it's so difficult for us to ask?
Yeah, there's a number of reasons why people find it difficult to ask for what they need. I think a lot of this does go back to our educational system. Little kids are really good. They ask questions all the time, and but that kind of gets drummed out of them because, over time there's peer pressure to not ask questions, or you're supposed to work on your own work, and, you know, asking for help is cheating, and, so people start that's one reason. But there's other reasons that feed into this. One is that a lot of times people don't ask because they think no one can help them. They underestimate the willingness and ability of other people to help. And there's a number of really interesting studies that have been done, which shows that even strangers are willing to help if they are asked. So, so that's one. Another one is that people are afraid, and this is particularly true in the workplace, of asking for what they might need because they are concerned they're going to look weak or incompetent or ignorant or not able to do their job. But here the research is helpful for correcting that belief. The research says that as long as we make an effective, thoughtful request, people will think you are more competent, not less. And so then that feeds into another reason, is that sometimes people just don't know what they really need. Or if they know what they need, they don't know how to ask for it. They don't know how to formulate an effective request. And so that's why I get down into the nitty-gritty in this book to really say, "Okay, what is it? Let's dissect what a request really is so that we can get better at asking for it." And it works, when my son was growing up, it worked with him if I applied this, for example, explaining the reason for the request, the why of the request is very important, but oftentimes we just assume that the other people know it's important. Well, they don't know why it's important. You need to tell people, whether it's your child that you're raising, whether it's your boss or peer or what have you.
And it's interesting when you talk about the why as well. But one of the things I really grabbed from the book, which I thought was really interesting, and as you need to practice this one thing because I actually thought I was asking a lot because when you pitch your own business, you're asking for a lot of things. But actually, you have to be very specific. If it's even with investors, with peers, with your business partner, like be very specific about what you're asking about. And one of the things is that there's some exercises and really good examples in the book, and maybe you can elaborate a bit like when you actually start mastering the art of asking, be we actually need to be very specific about the things we're asking, or else it's just going to go in as, oh, well, I'm not actually 100% sure what that person asked for. So now if I looking for a specific person, I would describe the person. I'm looking for this kind of person with this kind of experience, has done this before. Could you please put me in touch? That would be an example of where I would be very, very specific about that person. Or else we find an example on LinkedIn and say, this guy, as an example, you might know him, but this is really what I'm looking for.
Mhm. And so in the book, I talk about a SMART request, and I use
Yeah.
the acronym SMART as the elements of an effective or a thoughtful request. Now, we're all familiar with SMART goals. SMART requests is a little bit different. So the S in SMART is for specific. And again, this is something I learned over the years, was that the more specific your request, the more likely it will get fulfilled. A lot of times people think just the opposite. Well, if I make a general request or I cast a wide net, I'll get more answers, but that's not true. So the more specific, the better. The M in SMART is for meaningful, or the why of the request. And I'd mentioned before
Yeah.
that oftentimes people leave that out. We need to explain, why is it important? Why is it meaningful, this particular request that you want to make? And then the A in SMART is for an action. You're asking for something to be done. Sometimes, I saw that people would just restate their goal or their objective, but that's a goal is a destination. A request gets you a resource that you need to move towards that destination. So you're asking for something to be done. The R in SMART is for realistic, that it has to be within the realm of possibility. But I do encourage people to make stretch requests, make big requests. And then the last one is T for time, or when do you need it by? And
Mm,
the more specific you are, the better. So some people say, well, I just need it by the end of next year. You're not going to get much help. But if you say, I really need it by the end of the day for this reason, you're
mm.
much more likely to get help.
What about, you talk a bit about in the book as well that, you have to give to be able to take reciprocity. You talked
Mhm.
about before. And actually often people think that you said that people actually believe that other people would not help them. They don't want to give, but actually what also you come to the conclusion in the book is that the more you give, and ask, and people actually, that there's like this, kind of swing wheel effect, if you
Mhm.
use Jim Collins, where you slowly would see in these relationships or organizations that actually it just gets stronger and stronger because actually people love to give. We love to help. There's nothing better to somebody ask you for help than you feel important, I guess.
Right. Well, yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why a request can be effective is that, if I come to you, Michael, and say, I need your advice on this business idea, I'm
Yep.
acknowledging that you're a smart, well-educated, informed person, that you're a good person to go to for advice, right? I'm implicitly conveying that. That's one reason why a well thought out or effective request is people were more likely to see that you're competent rather than less competent. But yeah, there's, if you keep that smart criteria in mind, the beginning of it is what I call the pause, which is that you need to stop, pause, and really think about what is your objective? What is your goal? What are you trying to
Mm,
accomplish? I know that some people, after hearing this advice, will either they might end the business day thinking about what they're trying to accomplish the next day, or they might start early in the morning and say, okay, what am I trying to accomplish today? And then they've got that in mind. And then say, okay, well, what resources do I need? Do I need participation in a meeting? Do I need more information? Do I need a report? What is it? Then you formulate your smart request and then you have to figure out, well, who do you ask? You know, Oftentimes people say, well, I just don't know who to ask. Well, sometimes you don't know who to ask. Of course, if you do know, you should just go ask that person. But if you don't
yeah.
know, there's a lot of other things that you can do. For example, you could make a two-step request, which is, let's say that, I don't know who the expert is in a particular area, but I know someone who probably does know. So it's like 2 steps or even could be 3 steps. So you
Mm,
make that kind of you target your request to that particular person who's gonna introduce you 2 or 3 steps down the road. Or it could be that, you can reactivate what are called your dormant connections. A dormant connection is there's someone that you knew in the past, perhaps someone you worked with or went to school with, and your lives have gone in different directions and you've not stayed in touch. Well, a lot of people would be reluctant about reactivating a dormant tie, but here the research is helpful. The research says it's just the opposite. Most of your dormant connections would be delighted to
mm,
reactivate the connection, and they are really important sources of help because your lives have gone in different directions. They know different people and they know different things than you do, and so they can be even more helpful. And then finally, the last thing, if you don't know who to ask, is that you can post your request in a group. So it could be LinkedIn, it could be perhaps a Facebook group, or at work, there might be, different groups, maybe an affinity group that you're a part of at work, that you can post a request to that group. So it's not targeting any particular person. It's notifying the community that you need help for this reason by when, and that is really effective. In fact, when I was writing this book and I needed like a fresh example about something, I would use that last method of posting to a group, and I met people all over the world that way. It was just really wonderful. And I got examples and stories that I never would have gotten if I hadn't have asked and, posted my request to a group.
Yeah, and I guess also the amount of work you had to get these example also disappeared very quickly because normally if you want to find example, you either need to go out and do the research yourself or find it in somebody else's research.
Right. Exactly. And if what you're looking for is not written down anywhere, but it's something, a practice that someone does
Yeah.
or an experience they had, you're not going to find it in a book or an article or anything. You've got to find that person somehow through the network and hear their story.
Yeah, and I guess if we then say, okay, now we talked a bit about like the power of asking, you can incredible things can happen. We also talked a bit about, how you're gonna do it then and the barriers to that. We take that into an organizational settings. And I'm often thinking about that's really a place that may be very influenced by the education system as well, because very rarely what I've actually often as a senior person struggled is to get people to come either to me, ask for help, or ask their colleagues for help, like creating that whole, cycle of actually reinforcing that actually it's smarter to ask for help and wait. I'll see people Google answers instead of just going asking the
Right.
obvious person, because even though they know who that person is. uh, can you talk a bit about that and how that impacts, organizations, both when it's difficult, but also when you get really right?
Yeah. But another barrier is in some workplaces, we don't feel psychologically safe
Hmm.
to make a request. And it's true. In some workplaces, it's not very safe to make a request. But there are a number of things that, if you're heading up a team or a group or in a whole organization, things that you can do. One is that the leader should be a role model of the behavior that they want to see in other people. So if you want people to more freely ask for what they need and to give and get help from one another, you've got to be a role model of that behavior. You need to make yourself vulnerable and ask for what you need and make smart requests. And when other people do make requests, you need to acknowledge them for the fact that they actually made a request and how important it is that we do that in our group or team and so forth. So you got to reinforce it when you see it in other people, reward it in other people, and you need to exhibit the behavior yourself. Other things leaders can do, and I have a whole chapter of this in the book, is that there are a lot of tools and activities and approaches and methods that you can use that you can apply. So the reciprocity ring is one, but there are a lot of other ones that, even in a place that seems psychologically unsafe, if you use some of these methods as a group, people will start small and they'll make very safe requests. But then when they see that it works, it makes the place a little bit more psychologically safe. And when it's a little bit safer, then they're more likely to make a better request or a bigger request the next time. And then it becomes this virtuous cycle or a virtuous circle where it's getting safer because people are experiencing the power of asking for what they need, the power of generosity, and so forth.
And I guess when you talk an organization, you could have small to large organizations where you've probably seen people starting practicing this or the reciprocity circle. How do they manage that? How do they get it out to people? Because one thing is that you stand on stage and you send out, we're gonna start practicing this philosophy, and some line managers or directors would just grab that easier than others and go and implement it. What kind
Right.
of help can these companies look for? Where should they look for inspiration? Is there specific companies even you should go and have a look at if you think this is an interesting approach?
Yeah, so there's a number of answers. So one is
Yeah.
I'm recalling a student of mine who was an MBA student many years ago, and he was introduced to these ideas in the classes that I was teaching, and he worked for one of the really big global automakers,
Mm.
um, which didn't have the safest culture when it came to asking. However, he was running a little group of just 8 people, and in his world, he could do what he wanted to do, and his boss was skeptical, but when the boss started seeing the results he was getting, then, he was rewarded for actually doing it. So look and see what is your sphere of influence. In his case, he had these 8 people. That was his sphere of influence. He could work with them. Sometimes your sphere of influence is 2 people, 2 other people, and that's it. But that's a place to start. Now, at the other end, in terms of what like the CEO could do for a very large company, my one of my favorite examples is my friend and colleague Jim Malazzi, who was the CEO and uh, chairman of the board of Prudential Real Estate and Relocation, which is a very, very large company, primarily in the US, but it had offices in other places as well. And when he took over that company, uh, it was failing. They were losing millions of dollars every year. They were hemorrhaging their best talent. Customers didn't like them, but he knew about a lot of these techniques of positive leadership, about the power of asking and reciprocity. And from day one, from the first time that that when he gave his first talk to all the thousands of associates, either they were in a big convention center or they were streamed in from other places around the world, he modeled the behavior from the very first speech that he gave. So
Mm.
he did the usual thing, say, okay, a CEO, here's the corporate goals, et cetera, et cetera. But let me tell you what some of my personal goals are, and I need your help with these. And he stated, for example, some personal ones. So we revealed things about his personal life. So he was headquartered out in Arizona, so in the far west part of the states, but his family was back in Connecticut, which is in the eastern part of the state. So it's
Mm.
a long way across the country. And he said, he says, I don't want to miss any important events or dates or celebrations or anniversaries with my family. I'm going to need some help. Well, the help is in terms of how you schedule things and, asking for other people to assist and on and on. And there's a bunch of other things. He started this as a regular practice where he would reveal what his goals were, especially personal ones, and ask for other people to help. For example, he wanted to get fit. So he needed a jogging partner in the morning. So somebody came forward and said, I'll be your jogging partner in the morning. So things like that, even small things like that really showcase that whole behavior that, you know, not only it's not just okay to ask for what you need, it's expected. You should do it. It's good for all of us if you do.
Well, I think it's really interesting. Well, this example you gave of a CEO really asking for something personal, because then you also set the tone for what can be asked for within the company. Because often, people feel they have to leave their private life at home and can't take it to work, and that's not how life really works, and it just creates some complication. But you actually understand what other people need, especially your peers or colleagues. You can actually really help them. It could be not planning meetings at that time, or expecting them to be available at certain times, because you understand why they need that.
Right. Or somebody says, we have a new team that's formed and I'm all in, but I have to leave at 4:30 to pick up my little kids, at preschool to get them home in time, but I could be back on later so people would know, okay, well, this person has to leave at 4:30. We won't ask that person to go past that, but they're totally dedicated to use the time that they have before and after for the business. And I often will advise people that when they try out some of these activities, for example, the reciprocity ring is a good one. When I have enough time, I will do 2 rounds of requests. So the first round is everyone has to make a request, and I go through some of the methods in the book about, and some worksheets, et cetera, to come up with a well-formulated request. So people give a lot of thought to it before they actually make the request. But I'll say in our first round, cannot be related to work, cannot be related
Mm.
to the business, cannot be related to the industry, nothing. It has to be something about your personal life. And then people will s I was amazed what people would they were then liberated to make a request for things, and there were sometimes things that would bring you to tears of what people needed and why they needed it. And then I said, "Okay, in the second round, okay, this could be business related. In fact, it has to be business related in the second round." And what I found is that that first round, when people would share more about themselves personally and
Yeah.
give and get help, if you get help about a personal matter that's really important to you, that it starts to build this foundation of trust. and confidence and connection with one another. And that really becomes the whole base that enables them to be even better at the business, solving the business problems.
And it comes back to psychological safety again. The stronger that is in an organization, we know that from others we had on the podcast with leaders that's really focusing on that, creating that psychological safety. Actually, the easier it gets to create very great results and turn things around.
Yeah.
Is there anyone you've seen that's taken this practice where they actually turned around a very bad situation and you could almost trace back that one of the foundational things for that was actually being able to ask better questions in the organization or asking for help?
Yeah, there's a couple of people come to mind, but my favorite example would be this was a former student of mine from several years ago, a different one than the one I mentioned before.
Yeah.
His name was John, and he had just become the young CEO of a three-generation business. It was the food wholesale business, and if you know food wholesale, the margin's very, very, very
Yeah.
thin,
Razor thin,
right?
yeah.
And what he discovered when he became the CEO is that the business was failing, and he had 6 months to bankruptcy.
Wow.
And so he's like, "Well, what am I gonna do?" Well, he started to apply he applied a number of things, but one of the things that he applied was the stuff that we talk about in the book. In fact, I have an example. He's in the book in one of the latter chapters. And really, it was a very us versus them culture that he inherited where the workers, didn't really trust the management, and the management was trying to do the best thing. In fact, the managers were putting their own money in it to keep the business afloat, but, it was a lot. And so he started down this process, and eventually was able to turn things around, to create a more positive culture where people would freely ask for what they need and they would give and get help from one another. And then the pandemic hit. Now, what happened during the pandemic, we know there were lockdowns and restaurants were people weren't going to restaurants. Well, restaurants were one of their big they were a food wholesaler. That was one of their big customers were the restaurants and casinos and so forth. Well, they got together and they had built this positive culture up to leading up to that time. And they collectively figured out ways in which that during the pandemic, they had their best year ever in terms of sales, in terms of profits, and so forth. And it's because they had built that foundation and turned a psychologically unsafe workplace into a psychologically safe workplace. And it's really an amazing turnaround story. And the test, the experiment, if you will, is well, what would happen during the pandemic and a lockdown? And it turned out that it's what enabled them to not only survive, but to thrive.
Yeah, and I guess because when the crisis hit, they were already ready. They were already, because of the psychological safety levels, were already ready to handle the crisis better than if they were
Right.
feeling unsafe or slightly unsafe. So I think it's a brilliant story and it is in the book. And if anyone, people on this podcast is connected with food, knows how tough those businesses are and how razor thin the margins is, and exactly often on the culture bit that businesses fail. It's a typical good to great kind of example, the death spiral, the starts, and it actually comes from not feeling psychological safe. So I think it's a very great example there, Wayne. What about technology and asking? Because I think what I've noticed often is often people rather like to Google the answer or
Yeah.
use technology. It feels a bit more safe than maybe face the person and ask. I think that's one of my own experience. Maybe I'm wrong, but people really like to use technology to get the conversation started and asking for things. So we actually use technology to use LinkedIn to get it in conversation. So I could ask you if you wanted to come on the show.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Or now these days people are using Chat GBT,
Yeah.
right, to make requests, which I use as well, and I'm
Yeah.
learning it, and it's really a great tool, for research and so forth. I think all of that, Google, Chat GBT, all this, those if those are methods are all can be effective and helpful, and we should use them. But a lot of times, what we need is somewhere out there in the network, the human network, and we have to tap into that in some way. But we can use technology to tap into it. So one of Over the years, we were always asked when we would run some of our activities, and our activities were always face-to-face activities. Now, it could be, oh, it could be 1,000 people that we would then break up into smaller groups, and there are other ways of doing it, but it was always face-to-face. And people always said to us, invariably said to us, "Can you create an app for that? Is there an app that will do what we wanna do?" And I would say, you could use Facebook, LinkedIn, which can be effective. So finally, we decided that we were gonna, create a technology which is called Givitas.
Mm.
Givitas is a combination of giving and civitas, which is Latin for community, this idea, and can we use technology to build a community, a virtual community? It could be for people anywhere in the world where they'd be in these very, very large groups. And you would be able to post a request using, the smart criteria and so forth, post a request and then you can respond to other requests. And hopefully, would this really work? And the fact is that it does work. In fact, there's one of my current research projects is that we use this system with a group over about 500 people over a 7-week period. And in particular, we were interested in to what extent would it create a more inclusive network? What I mean
Mm.
by an inclusive network is that it would make connections across different demographic lines, whether it's racial lines or gender or what have you. Would it create a more integrated, inclusive network? And so we ran it. And so we're analyzing the data right now. And it shows very clearly that in this environment, people were posting requests, not to anyone in particular. They posted to the entire group and that people would respond. And what we learned is that they weren't responding in terms of whether is this the same kind of person as me, right? This person
Mm.
look like me? That was like they ignored that. And so it really did create a more inclusive network and enable this giving and getting of resources. Now, I've mentioned other things like Facebook. So I'm in one or two Facebook groups for particularly hobbies that I have. So I lived in the Midwest in the US, which is surrounded by the Great Lakes, which contain about 20% of the world's fresh water. And they're like inland seas. They're very large. And so I like to go boating. Right. And so there's groups of people, if you have, a particular interest like sailing on the Great Lakes, or if you have a particular kind of boat, there's a Facebook group for that, and so I would post a request to that, right? I'm thinking of going here and here. Has anyone gone there before? Right. And explain why and when I was going to go, use the smart criteria. So there's a lot of groups out there already, LinkedIn groups, Facebook groups, groups that we have that are technological groups in our workplaces that we can use as well. So it's one of the many ways in which we can find a community to make a request to.
In your book, you mention actually a guest that's been on the show or his business, him Ari and Paul's business, Singerman's, as an example of a business that is very good at involving their people and actually, asking them for requests, but also, encourage them to ask. And he was also the one of them that said you should get Wayne on the show at some point. That'd be really, really, really interesting to listen to. Can you talk a bit about why you actually choose Singermans in the book? Because often still when I refer people to Singermans in the business context. They never heard about them, and especially in the world I am in food, I'm a bit surprised I never heard about Singermans. So it's still this little incredible organization in Michigan who has built from a little deli now to plus 18 businesses, doing really really well. But it all comes down to, I would say, you call it psychological safety in your book, like really strong culture, but can you talk a bit about why you choose them as an example? Because they are a bit of an outlier compared to general businesses you would choose.
Right. They really do run their business in a very different way. And it is a way in which really, it's very human centric in the way that they do it. And there's a number of things. Yeah. So Zingerman's it's well known in the food industry, and it's become a destination for people to know about it who will come to Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is near Detroit. They will come there in order to visit and eat as several of the Zingerman's businesses that are there. And yeah, they started in the early '80s as a small deli and have grown into like a $70 million business. But one reason that they're not as well known is that they made a decision to always stay in the Ann Arbor area. They had many opportunities to franchise. Let's franchise that deli and we'll put it in Las Vegas, or let's franchise it and we'll put it in Florida or whatever. And they're always getting invitations to do this, but it's not part of what their vision is. So there's a lot of elements. They have a whole system. So I'll just highlight a few of them. One is that they have a very clear vision of what success looks like for them in the future. So they have a vision for so by the year of 2030, what do they want to be? Right. And part of that is that we will still be in the greater Ann Arbor area. Right. And we will develop, food related businesses. We're not going to duplicate. We won't have two delis, but we'll have some complementary businesses. So they already have the vision of what they're trying to create. That's a part of it. They have systems such as open book management, which is sometimes, people say, well, you share the financials, which they do. If you were there, they'd show you the financials if you asked to see them. But it's more than just the financials. It's they have a system by which they involve people, everyone. You could be the busboy, a server, a cook, a line manager, one of the senior managers of the whole business uh, on a regular basis, they get together and they will, discuss the last week, what happened. They have numbers, very specific numbers for every business. And it's not just financial numbers, it could be quality numbers and what they're trying to achieve in the next week. And this idea that we talked about before of being clear about what your goal is. And then the system enables them to make requests. Well, if our goal is to do this by next week, like to increase sales of this particular product, how are we going to do it? And then, then they will brainstorm about how it's gonna be done. So the ideas that I write about in the book are like a part of their fabric, the ways they do it. So it's a very well-developed system that's evolved over time. Now, sometimes people see what Zingerman's have done and say, "Well, that's a lot, right? How can I can't replicate all that all at once." And I'd say, "Well, you don't wanna do that. What you wanna do is pick
Mm.
a place to start."
Yeah.
Right? Whatever it might be, a place to start and then learn and grow from that. Oh, and by the way, I'll mention that if people do want to learn a lot more about Zingerman's, Ari, the CEO, is a prolific writer and he has many books. They also have pamphletized the books. So there's like smaller pieces of it that you can read as well. So it's very easy to learn more if anyone wanted to.
Yeah, and he's an avid reader as well, and I have most of the book, and it's, you can get overwhelmed, as you said, but you have to start somewhere. And I think you talked about open book management, which I think I've tried that in other business I've been involved in, and exactly, one of the most effective way of involving people in finance without it becomes finance. It becomes actually how can you move the bar, and actually you get surprised how much your people actually can improve your business, actually turn it around if that's what you need to do, or improve the financial. And you're all accountable for the P and L. And I think it's a great game of business by Jack Stack, which is a
Yeah.
totally different conversation, but it's an incredible piece of work they've done. And now they're also teaching that, so you can go on the Great Game of Business website, and
Yeah.
that's a different way of learning of asking very business specific things, and make everybody a business person in the business.
I can give you one quick example of when Zingerman's created one of its restaurants called the Roadhouse, which has been
Yeah.
around for a while now. In the beginning, it had startup troubles, and one was that they were wasting a lot of food, so their food costs were excessive, were too high. So who did they ask? Again, this coming back to asking. They asked the busboys. Right, because the busboys were the ones who were scraping off the plates with all the wasted food, into the waste bin, right? So they knew what wasn't being eaten or what was they were serving too large of portions of or that sort of thing. But it's not like the usual thing. We'll get all the senior people together and then we'll figure out what's going on. No, they asked the people who were actually handling the food, "What is it?" And it's a really good example. I love that example because the busboys had the answers.
Yeah. And they were thinking all along, why are we not doing anything about that. That's an incredible big waste we're doing here. Wayne, you have an incredible book, but if you had to give another book away, 9 out of 10 times, what would that book be?
Oh, well, like, can I mention 2 books?
Yeah, you can mention 2. That's great.
Okay. So, I would mention one of Ari's books, like his book about beliefs or his
Yeah,
book about open book management. I would recommend Ari's books, of course.
yeah.
And then in a completely different industry, I would, recommend a book by my friend Shelley Archambault, whose book is called Unapologetically Ambitious. And she was a senior executive at Xerox, and then she became a CEO of a tech company and other things, and now she's very active board director. But she actually Shelley and I met because our books were represented by the same agent. That's how we
Mm.
met. We've been in touch, over all these years. She's been a guest speaker in my class and so forth. But her book, Unapologetically Ambitious, I think is a very, very helpful book for people that are in business, starting out, looking at a career in business, because I think it's a very positive way of looking at it, but also a very savvy way of thinking about business.
Yeah, and it's very interesting you said the power of beliefs because we interviewed, or I interviewed Ari on that book because I thought it was one of the most, it just put so many things together. It was like the missing element in how you actually build a great culture for me, because
Mhm,
actually what we believe is what we're going to go and do. So
mhm,
if you believe people are lazy, you're going to go and do all their work and they can feel that you think badly about them. And it was like these, the circle of beliefs and how your actions build and how an organization's build it. And it's such again, a very simple idea, but it's a great book. It's heavily researched. And I think it took him some years to write that book, but it's
mhm.
probably one of the most powerful business book I have read as well, and it's one I also like to give away. So I thought there were some really, really great examples. What would be your top advice, Wayne, here on the last couple of questions to leaders out there that are trying to build a business as a force for good, a business that's do more than just make profit, also do some very good things for people, community, and the planet?
Well, somebody once said that the secret to happiness is indirect. Is that
Mm,
if you try to pursue happiness directly, you won't be happy because that means you'll try to engage in activities that are like watch a movie or go out to dinner or do things that are supposed to make us happy, and they do for a short period of time. They said that the path to happiness is indirect, which is that by pursuing meaningful work and building quality relationships with other people, you will be happy as a byproduct.
mm,
So the same thing is true in business, is that if your main goal is shareholder value, to be profitable and that's it, that's like pursuing happiness. You'll make decisions that will increase short-term profits, but it's not going to create a sustainable business that is a force for good in the world. It has to be that idea of, you have to have a vision of what is your contribution to the world. And when you make that contribution, profits will come as a byproduct. So it's a different way of thinking about it, but I think it's a very helpful way. I would encourage anyone who is to look at Zingerman's visions. They published them so you could see what was their vision, a number of years ago when they were a young company. What's their vision now? And you'll see that, you know, profit is part of it, right? But when you read it, profit is what enables them to continue to grow, to share resources, to reward their employees, and to continue to be a force for good in the world, but it's not their primary motivation. Now that's heretical in many spheres, and I teach at a business school, but that's what I teach, right? Is that if you really want long-term sustainable profitability, you need to focus on what is your contribution to the world.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting again, and you touched on Singerment, and I think there's a lots of great organization being built actually out from the social mission, but they actually understand that profit is the tool, and actually to get there, actually to live that mission fully, and really do the impact. I talked with somebody earlier this week where he was very much about, how can he actually end, child hunger. He started this business because he wanted to, in a way, to feed 1 million kids. That was the mission, and that's actually, and funny enough, the business come off the ground, and he thought he would be selling, an ingredient to kitchen. Now he's selling a snack bar because that
Hmm.
was the way, you could both deliver, a very good product for humans and the planet, but also you could make that profit that was needed to
Hmm.
actually serve the wider mission, which I think is incredible story. Where what be one question you wished I've asked you, Wayne? And what would the question be, and, what would you answer?
Yeah, I guess the so I mentioned that I've recently became a professor emeritus, which means I've retired from the university, but and I joked with you saying that that means I'm still working, I'm not getting paid anymore. So I guess the question would be like, so what does somebody do? So I'm continuing to do this, to have these wonderful opportunities, like to speak to you today. And so I try to live what I wrote about in the book, right? Is
Yeah,
that all you have to do is ask. And
yeah.
so I try to respond when people make requests, as you have. I'm very happy to do so. But I'm also trying. I'm working on a new book, which you probably wouldn't even
Mm.
know about because it's a work of fiction, and
Ah,
so that's something. And I don't know where it's going to go. I'm kind of in the beginning parts of it, but and I have writer's superstition, so which means I can't talk about it too much. But hopefully, some year down the road, I'll have another book, but it'll be a contribution to in a different way.
super interesting, Wayne, and a very, very good question, actually. Yeah, but what are you doing then? But it seems like you're still working on contributing positivity to the world and make it a better place. Where can people connect and find out more about you and the work, and especially if they want to know more about the book? Of course, they can go and buy the book, but also is the website where there's more materials?
Yeah, there's a website for a book, and then there's my personal website. And the book website, I have a lot of free resources. For example, there's an infographic that's like the all you have to do is ask journey, like it's the whole process, and you'll see, it kind of outlines the parts of the book and so forth. And it's a really helpful single page, very colorful reminder of the whole process that we've talked about. So it's the book title, which is all you have to do is ask.com. And there's a whole bunch of other free resources there. You can take an online assessment. It's one of the assessments that's in the book, but the one that's on my website is free. And if you enter your email address, it will also give you a comparative report. So we'll see how your responses stack up with a population. So it's very
Mm.
insightful. In fact, sometimes when people say, "How do I get started in this process?" I'd say, "Well, have you and a couple of other people take this assessment." So
Yeah.
that's free. It's up on the website. All you have to do is all you have to do is ask.com. My personal website is my name, waynebaker.org. And as you know, Michael, you can find me on LinkedIn too.
Yeah. That's where I found Wayne, so, that's a good spot to reach out. Thank you so much, Wayne. I send you, power and energy on the journey ahead, and good luck with the new book. I'm gonna look forward to that, and I will read it because I actually read nonfiction books, a lot of the time, and then at night, I need something that takes me out of the world of business, or else the brain just moves on, and thinking about solving problems. So, actually, I need to downward. So, actually, I'm reading no totally normal biographies and so on in the night, and also, fiction books.
Well, great, Michael. I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak with you. It's been a very enjoyable conversation.